Mexico is feeling the wrath of a powerful drug cartel after an army operation resulted in the death of its leader. Known as El Mencho, he was one of the most wanted men in both Mexico and the United States. His killing has sparked violence across the country, resulting in dozens of deaths, including several Mexican National Guard troops.
Eyewitnesses shared footage on social media of people panicking at this airport in the Mexican state of Jalisco as vehicles were set on fire outside. A wave of violence spread across Mexico after a special forces raid killed drug lord Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, also known as El Mencho. Gunmen set fire to cars and shops, blocked highways and clashed with security forces in several states across Mexico. Late Sunday, authorities said most of the 250 cartel roadblocks across 20 states had been cleared, but warned people to stay inside. Since US President Donald Trump took office, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has been under increasing US pressure to crack down on drug cartels.
All operations were carried out by federal forces. US forces were not involved. What there is a lot of interchange of information, as we've said several times.
El Mencho was the leader of one of Mexico's fastest growing and most powerful criminal networks, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. It's notorious for drug trafficking and extreme violence. The raid against Jalisco is being seen as a sign that authorities are now taking the fight to the cartels. But there are also fears that targeting leaders could trigger a surge in violence, with some cartels left fractured and others seeking to exploit the power vacuum.
Gonzalez Ormerod is a journalist who writes about Mexican politics on the Substack, The Mexican Political Economist. Alex, welcome to DW. You wrote today that the killing of Mexico's biggest cartel boss, and I'm quoting you here, isn't necessarily good news. What exactly are you concerned about here?
Thank you for having me on, Nicole. Well, yes, as you say, it is good news overall, right? One of the most bloodthirsty criminals in Mexico has been taken out of the picture. They wanted to capture him. He ended up dying in the gunfight. However, as your report mentions, the great problem that we've been through for over 20 years at this point is if you kill the drug leader of a cartel organization, what you get is many leaders in a fractured cartel. It's like cutting off the Hydra's head. That's why President Claudia Sheinbaum, I think, has done a better job in moving through intelligence, trying to cut off the finances. But when the intelligence came in, I think the capture of El Mencho was too good to resist, and so they moved.
What should the government's next steps be to avoid a violent turf war?
So I think they've already started, which is interesting. Not so much in the news was the fact that they killed El Mencho's number 2 man, who was in charge of logistics and finance. That's why, even though it was a very dramatic show of force, by today, everything's pretty back to normal in Mexico now. It's because the authorities flared out quite effectively. What they now need to do is to continue working with US colleagues and with the intelligence services here in Mexico to crack down on the rest of the organization. It's not enough to get rid of its leader, you have to dismantle the entire organization. And so that's the incredibly hard task they've got in front of them.
Yeah, Sheinbaum, she came to power vowing to fight an organized crime. Now, has she been doing much to address the structures that allowed El Mencho to get to where he was?
The short answer is yes. Overall, I think the stats speak for themselves, independently verified stats. Mexico's murder rate is declining precipitously. We'll see if that holds with any conflagration within the Jalisco cartel. But for the moment, since she came to office about a year ago, violent crime and mostly homicide has gone down by 40%, making Mexico safer than Brazil and more or less on par with Puerto Rico. Mexico City, for example, is safer than Washington, D.C. or Chicago. So that shows you more or less the sort of complexity of the situation. But again, right, these are very powerful organizations. Flare-ups have happened before, like in the state of Sinaloa. The reason the cartel of Jalisco became so powerful was because it filled in the space after the government came in and decapitated the Sinaloa cartel, leaving that space open for a new cartel.
I want to look at the timing for a second. In your opinion, was this a move mostly to appease Donald Trump as he increasingly asserts his power in America's so-called backyard? Or is this more about Sheinbaum's own agenda?
It could well be both. Ultimately, as I said, Mexico has been here for 20 years. Decapitation is not the most feasible way of getting rid of cartels. However, the arrival on the scene of a new player, which is this new task force from the US completely focused on cartel networks, I think may change the picture a bit because it allows Mexican intelligence and US intelligence to work together to really crack down on the operations of these cartels. But it's really important to say this, so long as Americans continue letting millions of dollars worth of drug proceeds back into Mexico after buying them, that demand will continue.
That was Gonzalez Ormerod of The Mexican Political Economist. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Great to speak to you.
Thank you, Nicole.
Let's cross straight to Mexico City and speak to journalist Katie Silver. Welcome, Katie. Now, El Mencho's killing has triggered violent retaliation across the country. The president now says the situation is under control. In real terms, though, what does that mean? Back to normal?
I guess somewhat. We do feel here in the capital city things inching back to life. This morning there was still a lot of trepidation. The streets are very, very quiet. They are still somewhat quiet, and there has certainly been a lot of helicopters overhead, but it does seem for the most part the country getting back to life as normal. Some Mexican people have been speaking say that they're kind of accustomed to these sorts of things, although of course it does make them question whether or not they're going to want to be traveling to other parts of the country. The state of Jalisco, that remains under code red, which has seen schools closed there, for example, most people sheltering in place. That does seem to be lifting. We understand, for example, public transport coming back online. The state of Michoacan also has had schools closed. All of that does seem to be alleviating, but we know as well that there's been a huge deployment of the National Guard to try and mitigate some of these issues. And so that is perhaps as well what is behind, I guess, some of this slow returning to normal that we're seeing here in the city.
At this point, what is known about how the death of El Mencho came about?
It's really quite a remarkable story. So what has emerged today is that it was actually a tip-off from one of El Mencho's lover's friends. So she went to visit him in the compound, we understand, I think Friday evening, and that was when authorities were tipped off. There was, of course, a $15 million US bounty on his head from the US State Department. So we understand that tip-off occurred. She was then followed, and they then monitored her. She then left the compound. And then working with this in conjunction with this US Special Task Force, they came up with a plan for the raid. That then occurred Sunday morning, and we saw the Mexican army raiding this site in Tapalpa, which is a city about 2 hours southwest, driving from the capital city of Jalisco, Guadalajara. And what ensued was gunfire. 8 members of the cartel, we understood, were killed in that initial gunfire. El Mencho and 2 of his bodyguards then retreated into a part of the complex, a wooden part of the complex, whereas there's a cabin. More gunfire ensued. He was injured along with 2 of his bodyguards, and then they were airlifted, due to be brought here to Mexico City for treatment, but they died en route. That's according to the Mexican authorities.
Tell us more about El Mencho and the role he played in the Mexican underworld.
Yeah, so he was an omnipresent figure when it comes to the cartels. He initially actually went to the US in his 20s as an undocumented immigrant, and there he got into the heroin trade. He ended up spending 3 years in jail in the US, returning to Mexico deported, and then from there, over the next 3 or so decades, he worked his way up in the cartels. He was in the Milenio Cartel as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel was previously known, and then when it was formed in 2009, he's been the head of it ever since. A omnipresent figure in the, as you said, in the Mexican underworld. This cartel, for its part, by many accounts, Mexico's most dangerous, most powerful, certainly growing in importance. Exports in the order of billions of dollars of fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine into the US. Such to the point that President Trump about a year ago declared it a terrorist organization. So very, very significant. And it has been associated, this cartel as well, with very sophisticated weaponry, grenades, rocket launchers. They even found some of these as part of the raid yesterday. So a very, very omnipresent figure here when it comes to the cartels.
That was journalist Katie Silver in Mexico City. Thanks so much, Katie. David Mora is the Mexico senior analyst at the International Crisis Group think tank, and he joins us from Mexico City today. David, welcome to DW. Now, Mexico is on edge after the killing of El Mencho. This cannot possibly be how authorities hope for this to go.
Yeah, well, that's right. I'm actually based connecting from Guadalajara, the capital of Jalisco, where most of the latest developments have happened. I think we, based on previous experiences, the government knew that this was they could expect that this was going to be the aftermath. I'm talking about when they tried to capture for the first time the son of El Chapo Guzman, Ovidio Guzman, in Culiacan in 2019, and then again in 2023. This is what these powerful criminal groups react, right? Setting buses, trucks, cars on fires, orchestrating blockades, sort of like to demonstrate as a show of force, to demonstrate the power, the coordination of the multiple criminal cells. In this specific case, what I think was shocking is how widespread it was. It was not only in Jalisco, the home state of Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, and the neighboring states, but it actually reached other parts of the country. It went as far as down as Veracruz, for instance, in the south, or even in Tamaulipas on the Mexico-U.S. border. So the magnitude of the aftermath is what really is striking to me.
Mm-hmm. You say you're in Guadalajara. Then my question, of course, is what's the situation right now? Are you sheltering in place? Are you aware of what's going on in the street of the city right now?
So I arrived here earlier before the events happened. I guess I was lucky in that sense. And certainly the city is mostly empty. The streets are empty. These 24 hours later, I came back from trying to get a coffee and a taco, which is quite an enterprise right now here in Guadalajara. And I saw a few more cars, but certainly, I mean, Guadalajara is Mexico's second largest city. And what you see on the streets right now doesn't really quite match with that status. Most businesses are still closed down. People are still sheltering in place. They're mostly doing their activities indoors. And it's quite impressive, right? Because again, this is a very large city.
Yeah. Now, this operation, does that indicate that Mexico is taking the gloves off to appease Donald Trump in a way?
So I think I would rate it on two different scales. The first one is the domestic one, and I think Mexico has taken off the gloves ever since Claudia Sheinbaum was elected and came into office. She certainly, Mexican armed troops under her watch have certainly acted more aggressively against organized crime groups in Mexico. There are reports of larger and more frequent confrontations among armed forces, government forces, and criminal groups. So this comes as, the next step in this more confrontational approach that Claudia Sheinbaum has taken. And on top of that, we cannot ignore, of course, the factor and the pressure that U.S. President Donald Trump has put on Mexico, specifically on Claudia Sheinbaum, to deliver these more outstanding, more significant outcomes in the fight against organized crime. So it certainly has to do with that as well. I would put it as the way that Claudia Sheinbaum has this operation demonstrates that her formula, what she's proposing to the U.S. works, which is, let's cooperate, let's have our security agencies working together, let's share information, let's share intelligence, but let the Mexican troops do the operation on the ground. We don't need U.S. troops on Mexican soil. Us Mexicans can do it. So this is her underpinning that strategy vis-a-vis Donald Trump.
Yeah, very much a signal to the United States. We'll have to let you go in a second, but maybe briefly, if you can't, how much is this operation, the killing of El Mencho, actually going to weaken the cartel?
So unfortunately, the past experiences, history teaches us that just beheading, taking away, cutting off the head of the snake doesn't really magically end the operation, the criminal operation. Quite the opposite. What I'm expecting to see is internal struggles for control by different criminal groups, by different relevant operatives of the cartel to fight over control of the organization. So most likely we're going to see an increase in violence within the organization, and then in the turf wars that the organization has with smaller local criminal groups in different states of the country.
That was David Mora of the International Crisis Group. Thanks so much.
Thank you.